Welcome to a vintage model traction engine restoration, and this is part 11, how not to repair a leaky old copper water tank. The water tank that fits in the bunker leaks very slightly, and I thought I'd fix the leak by applying some JB Weld, which is 2-pack epoxy resin, to the part of the tank that I thought was leaking. And how wrong I was about that. With the tank on the bench, it's time to take a good look at it. This is the original patch that I thought was the problem, and this just sort of fell off. I think it was put in place using Evo stick or some type of contact adhesive. Anyway, this was one potential area where it was going to leak. When I fitted the bunker tank back into the bunker, I left it full of water overnight, and the next morning there was quite a good quantity of water on the bench. Apart from the fact that this small patch was stuck in place with some sort of glue, and as I've just mentioned, I also applied some JB Weld to it, I think I can rule out the patch as being the leaky area. Nevertheless, I'm going to start by patching the tank properly. This part is called soldering essentials. The first rule of successful soldering is the parts need to be very clean. So I'm using my Proxxon angle grinder fitted with a flapper wheel to thoroughly clean up the area where I'm going to solder a patch in place. When doing this, it's a good idea to wear a breathing mask, because most soft solder, particularly in the time of this engine, would have contained lead, and lots of it. This clip shows the copper tank looking very clean in the area where I'm going to solder the patch. Step 2. You don't have to do it this way, you can do it the hard way and tin each surface separately, then put the parts together and heat them up so that the two layers of solder melt into one. This stuff is called Friolux solder paint, and it's a mixture of ground up lead and flux. And here I'm making the first mistake, I'm putting far too much on. Don't forget, this episode is called How Not to Repair an Old Leaky Copper Water Tank. I've also applied some Friolux to the patch. This patch, by the way, is just a square of brass that I cut from a sheet. This next part is so totally over the top, I've added some plumber's type flux. Now it's time for the heat. It is actually very important to turn your blowtorch down when you're doing this. The blast of a propane blowtorch, which you would normally use for silver soldering, will really destroy a tank like this. But in this clip all about how not to do the job, the blowtorch is turned up too high, and as you can see, there's plenty of heat and the solder is really melting. In this clip I'm adding some plumber's solder to the mix. It's running quite well, and the part is floating on top of a sea of solder and flux. This corner of the tank is quite hot, and I can easily move the patch back into position. What I'm doing here is still applying the heat and wiping off the surplus flux and solder using a paintbrush dipped in water. But then I thought I would apply some more plumber's solder to really make sure that this is a good joint. When you look at this, you can see there's quite a lot of plumber's solder on top of the patch, which is totally unnecessary. So here I'm wiping that off. I left the tank for a while to cool, and in this clip once again I'm using the angle grinder, but this time to clean off the excess solder that was all over the patch. You will notice that in this area I'm also grinding off all of the burnt paint. And I end up with this, a tank with a patch that is definitely going to be watertight. I applied a disproportionate amount of solder, so where did it all go? When I picked up the tank, once it had cooled, and shook it, it rattled. And so I shook it vigorously, and quite a lot of blobs of solder came out of the big hole at the top. So that's where the solder went. I need to plug the two holes where the fittings go. I could machine up a couple of blanking plugs, but that's a bit of a waste of time. I'm using 2 pieces of wooden dowel. I've used wooden dowels just like this to plug boiler bushes when performing hydraulic tests, and they will stand a pressure of 200 psi easily. But do not misunderstand this. You must not use wooden plugs on any pressure vessel when it's got steam or compressed air inside it. It's only safe to do this to plug the hole for water and nothing else. I plugged both of the holes in the tank and then filled it with water, followed by wiping off the existing water on the bench and on the tank using an old towel. As you can see by this clip, when I move the tank, it's still leaking. But not from my patch, it never was leaking from that area. Using a small amount of ultraviolence with a very small hammer, I'm trying to peen over the edge of the tank because this is where it's leaking from. The seam is split. Bashing the tank with a hammer is not a good idea. I know what I'm doing, allegedly. And now, after bashing it with the hammer, it leaks even worse than it did before. In fact, the leak is really bad now. So looking at it, what have I achieved in this episode? Well, nothing at all. Apart from making a proper patch, the original, here in this clip, was unnecessarily small and stuck in place with glue, and it did leak a little bit. My patch is okay, it definitely doesn't leak. And thankfully, the other side of the tank doesn't leak at all, so that's a good thing. Just to recap, this isn't the way to do this job. It's always going to be difficult to repair old copper tanks, whether they're soft soldered or silver soldered, in the case of a boiler for instance. And if you're attempting to repair a tank and it looks like this, you're lost. There's far too much solder all over everywhere in this area of the tank, and it's in the wrong place. The tank still leaks. Using soft solder on model boilers to do what's called caulk the stays used to be popular, but it's not anymore, thankfully. But a friend of mine once arrived with this old boiler he'd bought off eBay and asked me if I could re-caulk it. I did, and it took 3 hours and drove me mad. After each soldering session, I had to pressurise the boiler, then it leaked in a different place, and so on and so forth. Repairing old copper tanks is not good. In the next episode, I'll show you how I repaired it. It's a bit of a cliffhanger, but it's better than throwing yourself off the cliff in desperation. Maybe I should make a new tank, but then no, it would not be a sympathetic restoration. So that's it for now. Until next time, stay safe, stay well. Thanks for watching, and I hope you found it useful. Please take the time to visit my Mainsteam Models website and click on the section of the website that says Video Playlists. And by doing that, you can find other videos that you may like to watch. And by using the playlists, you can actually watch the videos back to back.